By the late summer of 1781, the American Revolution had become a war of converging lines. For 6 years, the conflict had refused to end. Britain had seized New York, but not the rebellion. Saratoga had brought France openly into the war. The South had burned through Charleston, Camden, Kings Mountain, Cowpens, Guilford Courthouse, and the long campaign of Nathanael Greene. Cornwallis had marched into Virginia, hoping to break the supply base that kept the Southern resistance alive. Instead, Virginia began to become a trap. Cornwallis fortified Yorktown and Gloucester Point on the York River. From his perspective, the position made sense. The Royal Navy was still the central instrument of British imperial power. A coastal post could be reinforced, supplied, or evacuated by sea. If ships came, Yorktown was a base. If ships did not come, it was a cage. Lafayette understood that his task was not to destroy Cornwallis alone. He had too few men for that. His job was to watch, shadow, delay, and keep Cornwallis from disappearing before larger forces could arrive. Lafayette had spent months retreating, returning, probing, and refusing to be trapped himself. To the north, Washington still faced the old problem of New York City. For years, New York had been the obvious British target and the obvious American frustration. Washington wanted to strike it, but a direct assault required naval power. Without the sea, New York was a fortress tied to empire. Then French strategy changed the world of possibility. Rochambeau and Washington learned that Admiral de Grasse intended to sail from the Caribbean to the Chesapeake. If the French fleet controlled the bay, Cornwallis could be isolated. If the Allied armies marched south quickly and secretly, the war might produce the decisive siege Washington had been seeking for years. This was the kind of moment commanders wait for and fear. Opportunity was real, but fragile. A delayed message, a British fleet, a failed march, a disease outbreak, a mistake in timing, any of these could break the plan. Washington and Rochambeau chose speed and deception. They made Clinton in New York believe that an attack on the city might still be coming. Meanwhile, the Allied army began moving south. French soldiers, continental troops, wagons, artillery, horses and supply columns marched through the summer roads of the Middle Atlantic. The Revolution's scattered threads were tightening. Yorktown could not be won by land alone. That is the first thing to understand about the campaign. Washington had spent much of the war learning the limits of armies without fleets. Britain could move by sea. Britain could reinforce ports. Britain could evacuate troops. Britain could turn geography into power. At Yorktown, that had to change. Admiral François-Joseph Paul, Comte de Grasse, sailed from the Caribbean toward the Chesapeake with a powerful French fleet. His arrival transformed the campaign. He brought ships, sailors, troops, and most important, control over the water Cornwallis needed. The British understood the danger. A fleet under Admiral Thomas Graves moved to challenge de Grasse. On September 5, 1781, the fleets fought off the Virginia Capes in what became known as the Battle of the Chesapeake. The battle did not look like a land battle. There were no infantry lines crossing fields, no cavalry charges, no bayonet assaults against redoubts. Instead, ships maneuvered under wind, signal flags, smoke, cannon fire, and the complicated geometry of naval war. The result was decisive because of what did not happen. The British did not break French control of the Chesapeake. They did not open a road to Cornwallis. They did not restore the sea power that Yorktown required. De Grasse held the bay. That meant Cornwallis could not count on evacuation. He could not assume relief would arrive in time. The river and the sea, which had seemed to protect him, now helped surround him. French naval power had become the hinge of American independence. This is one of the most important facts of the Revolution. The United States did not win alone. American endurance mattered. Washington mattered. The Continental Army mattered. Militia, diplomats, state governments, privateers, and civilians mattered. But at Yorktown, French ships made the final military victory possible. The alliance was not charity. France had its own imperial reasons for fighting Britain. Spain and the Dutch also changed the global balance. But motives do not erase consequences. The American cause survived because the British Empire was forced into a global war. At Yorktown, that global war sailed into the Chesapeake. And on land, the Allied armies were coming. The march to Yorktown was one of the great acts of coordination in the war. Washington and Rochambeau moved the Allied army away from New York and down the Eastern Corridor. The route passed through New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Maryland toward Virginia. Soldiers who had once watched the Hudson now marched toward the Chesapeake. The march required secrecy, logistics, money, discipline, and trust. French troops brought a level of polish that many Americans noticed. Their uniforms, artillery, engineers, and supply organization made a strong impression. American soldiers, hardened by years of hunger and rough campaigning, marched beside them. The alliance was no longer just a treaty or a diplomatic promise. It was a column of men moving together toward a shared battlefield. Washington also made a deeply personal stop. On the way south, he visited Mount Vernon for the first time since taking command in 1775. He had left home expecting service, duty, and perhaps a short conflict. 6 years later, he returned briefly as a commander, still carrying the war on his shoulders. That visit was not the end of his service. It was a reminder of what he had postponed. By September, Washington reached Virginia. Lafayette's force joined the Allied concentration. De Grasse controlled the bay. Rochambeau's French army stood with the Americans. Artillery and supplies gathered. Cornwallis remained inside his defenses. The trap was becoming visible. But a siege is not simply a large army waiting outside a town. It is a science of pressure. Engineers choose lines. Soldiers dig trenches. Artillery is dragged into position. Batteries are built. The besieging army moves closer by stages, protecting itself while tightening the circle. Yorktown would be won with shovels as much as muskets. For the men in the trenches, glory looked like mud. They dug under darkness, hauled fascines, carried gabions, listened for enemy fire, and watched the sky for shells. The work was exhausting, repetitive, and dangerous. For Cornwallis, every Allied trench meant less space, less time, and less hope. The world had narrowed to earthworks, cannon, ships, and waiting. On September 28, 1781, the Allied army arrived before Yorktown. Washington, Rochambeau, Lafayette, French engineers, American officers, artillery commanders, and thousands of soldiers now focused on the British position. Cornwallis had built defenses around Yorktown, with Gloucester Point across the river. But he was outnumbered, surrounded by land and blocked by sea. The Allies began formal siege operations. They opened the first parallel, a trench line that allowed artillery to move closer while protecting the men who served the guns. The work was done at night. Soldiers dug in silence or near silence, knowing that discovery could bring fire. On October 9th, the Allied bombardment began. French and American guns opened against Yorktown. Cannon and mortars hammered British positions. Shells arced over the darkness. Buildings shook. Earthworks splintered. The rhythm of artillery became the sound of inevitability. Washington himself is traditionally associated with firing or ordering the first American gun. Whether imagined in ceremonial detail or not, the symbolism mattered. The commander who had endured defeat, retreat, starvation, criticism, and uncertainty was now directing the siege that could end Britain's hope of victory. Inside Yorktown, British soldiers and German auxiliaries endured the bombardment. They were not caricatures. Many were veterans. They had marched through the South, fought hard, obeyed orders, and now found themselves trapped by forces beyond their control. Civilians and enslaved people around Yorktown also suffered the siege environment. War did not pause for non-combatants. Disease, hunger, fear, and displacement moved through the lines as surely as cannon fire. The Allied guns did their work. But one problem remained. 2 British outer positions, Redoubts 9 and 10, limited how close the Allies could bring their second parallel. Those redoubts had to be taken. The siege was about to become sudden, close, and dangerous. On the night of October 14, 1781, the Allies attacked. The targets were Redoubt 9 and Redoubt 10, British outer defenses that had to fall before the siege could tighten fully. The operation required coordination between French and American assault columns. The French attacked Redoubt 9. The Americans attacked Redoubt 10. Alexander Hamilton, eager for a field command and determined to prove himself, helped lead the American assault. The attackers moved with unloaded muskets, relying on bayonets to maintain speed and surprise. This was not because war had become romantic. It was because gunfire could break silence, slow the attack, and throw the assault into confusion. The men rushed through obstacles, ditch, and defensive works under fire. Redoubt 10 fell quickly. The French assault on Redoubt 9 faced hard fighting but succeeded as well. With both redoubts captured, the Allies could extend their siege works closer to the British line. The second parallel would bring the artillery into a position from which Yorktown became almost impossible to hold. Hamilton's reputation grew. French courage was proven again. American and French coordination had passed one of its sharpest tests. For Cornwallis, the situation darkened. He attempted a sortie against Allied positions, but it could not reverse the siege. He considered trying to escape across the York River to Gloucester Point and break away, but weather and Allied pressure made the plan fail. The water that had promised safety now trapped him. By October 17th, the British asked for terms. 6 years after Lexington and Concord, 5 years after the Declaration of Independence, 4 years after Saratoga, the British Southern Army was negotiating surrender in Virginia. The war was not over, but something enormous had broken. October 19, 1781, became one of the defining days in American history. The British Army marched out of Yorktown to surrender. Cornwallis did not personally attend the ceremony. He sent General Charles O'Hara in his place, reportedly claiming illness. O'Hara first approached Rochambeau, but Rochambeau directed him toward Washington. Washington, in turn, directed him to Benjamin Lincoln, the American general who had been forced to surrender Charleston the year before. The symbolism was unmistakable. At Charleston, Lincoln had suffered humiliation. At Yorktown, Lincoln accepted the surrender of Britain's defeated army on Washington's behalf. British troops laid down arms, drums beat, standards lowered, thousands of soldiers became prisoners. The road to Yorktown, so long and uncertain, had ended in a ceremony of reversal. Tradition later claimed the British band played "The World Turned Upside Down." The evidence is uncertain, but the phrase survived because it captured what people believed the moment meant. A colonial rebellion had trapped an imperial army. A republic that did not yet fully exist had forced a monarchy into negotiation. Men who had been called rebels stood as victors before one of the most powerful empires on earth. Washington did not celebrate wildly. His greatness often rested in control. He knew that surrender did not equal peace. British forces still held New York, Charleston, and other posts. The Royal Navy still existed. The British government still had choices. But Yorktown changed the political reality in London. Continuing the war now meant explaining how victory would be achieved after the surrender of a major army, amid a global conflict, with France and Spain pressing British interests around the world. The cost of conquest had become harder to defend. For the Americans, Yorktown brought relief and astonishment. Soldiers who had marched hungry, gone unpaid, and endured years of uncertainty saw proof that endurance could become victory. For France, Yorktown vindicated alliance, naval strategy, and revenge against Britain. For the world, Yorktown announced that the American rebellion could not be dismissed as temporary disorder. But the road from surrender to independence still had to be walked. After Yorktown, the war entered a strange twilight. The largest British offensive hope in North America had collapsed, but British troops still occupied New York City. Charleston remained in British hands until 1782. Savannah had only recently been evacuated. Fighting and raiding did not vanish instantly. The Atlantic War continued. Diplomacy moved slowly. For soldiers, this was a hard kind of victory. They had been told independence was near before. They had endured paper money, shortages, disease, and promises of pay that Congress struggled to fulfill. Now they could see the outline of victory, but they still had to wait in camps while politicians negotiated across the ocean. Washington returned north. The army remained under command. Discipline still mattered, so did patience. Britain faced its own political reckoning. Yorktown damaged the ministry that had carried the war. Opposition to continuing the conflict grew. The global nature of the war made settlement more complicated because Britain had to deal not only with the United States, but also with France, Spain, and the Netherlands. The American diplomats in Europe carried a different kind of battlefield into negotiation. Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay did not command armies, but their work mattered as much as any campaign. They had to secure recognition, territory, fishing rights, debts, and the future position of the United States among empires that did not necessarily want a strong republic in North America. France had been essential to victory, but American interests and French interests were not always identical. Spain wanted its own gains. Britain wanted to limit losses. Diplomacy required gratitude, calculation, suspicion, and nerve. At home, the revolution's contradictions remained. Independence promised liberty, but slavery survived. Native nations faced an expanding United States that would often treat British defeat as permission for American expansion. Loyalists faced exile, confiscation, or uneasy reintegration. The war had created a nation, but not a settled moral order. Yorktown had answered one question. Could Britain force the colonies back into obedience by military power? The answer was no, but Yorktown left another question. What kind of country would independence create? That question almost broke the army before the treaty was even signed. In early 1783, the Continental Army waited at Newburgh, New York. The men had won the war in everything but paperwork. Yet many officers and soldiers had not been paid properly. Congress, under the Articles of Confederation, lacked reliable power to raise revenue. States were slow or unwilling to provide money. Promises stacked up like unpaid debts. The army's anger was not imaginary. These men had sacrificed years. Some had lost health, property, opportunity, and family time. Officers feared they would be dismissed into poverty. Soldiers wondered whether the republic they had defended would honor them. Anonymous addresses circulated among officers, urging stronger action. The danger was clear. The army might pressure Congress in a way that threatened civilian authority. Some possibilities sounded like protest. Others sounded closer to military coercion. Washington saw the crisis for what it was. The revolution could be won on the battlefield and then lost in its final political test. On March 15, 1783, Washington appeared before his officers at Newburgh. He urged patience, loyalty, and faith that Congress would address their grievances. But the moment remembered most came when he took out a letter and reached for spectacles. He told the officers that he had grown grey in their service and now found himself growing blind. The room changed. The officers saw not only a commander, but a man who had suffered with them. Washington's emotional authority did what orders alone might not have done. The officers stepped back from the dangerous path. The army remained obedient to civilian power. Newburgh mattered because republics are not secured only by defeating enemies. They are secured by what victorious armies do when they possess power. Washington could have exploited anger. He could have presented himself as the indispensable man above Congress. Instead, he used his influence to protect civilian rule. The revolution had promised that power should answer to the people through their representatives. At Newburgh, that promise survived a frightening test. Peace was now close. On September 3, 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. The American negotiators were Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay. David Hartley represented Great Britain. The treaty formally ended the American Revolution and recognized the United States as independent. This was the diplomatic sentence the war had been trying to write since 1775. British recognition mattered because it transformed rebellion into sovereignty. The United States was no longer merely a collection of former colonies claiming independence. It had been acknowledged by the empire it had fought. The treaty also defined boundaries that opened enormous Western possibilities. The new United States gained claims extending toward the Mississippi River, though these claims collided with the realities of native nations, Spanish interests, British forts, and settlers already looking west. Fishing rights, debts, loyalist property, and prisoner issues all formed part of the settlement. Some provisions were easier to sign than to enforce. Peace on paper did not erase bitterness, displacement, or uncertainty. For Britain, the treaty was a loss, but not the end of empire. Britain still held Canada, Caribbean islands, India interests, naval power, and global reach. The empire would adapt. For France, victory brought prestige, but not financial relief. The cost of war deepened pressures that would later help destabilize the French monarchy. For Spain, the global settlement included imperial calculations of its own. For the United States, the treaty opened a future that was both exhilarating and dangerous. Independence had been achieved. Now Union had to be maintained, debt had to be handled, Western expansion had to be governed, state jealousies had to be managed, a weak national government had to somehow hold a vast political experiment together. The Treaty of Paris ended the war. It did not solve the revolution. It handed the revolution to the people who would have to build a country from it. In November 1783, British troops evacuated New York City. For most of the war, New York had been the great British base in America. It had been the city Washington lost in 1776, the city he watched for years, the city that symbolized both British power and American frustration. Now the British departure marked the visible end of occupation. Washington entered New York in triumph, but again the deepest scenes were not simply public celebrations. On December 4, 1783, he met his officers at Fraunces Tavern. The farewell was intimate and emotional. These men had survived a war together. They had known defeats, retreats, hunger, mutiny scares, political disappointment, and final victory. Washington did not stand apart from them as a distant statue. He embraced them as companions in an ordeal. The army was disbanding, the commander was leaving. The war world that had defined their lives since 1775 was dissolving. For many soldiers, peace did not mean comfort. Some returned to farms, debts, injuries, uncertain pensions, and communities changed by war. Some had no easy place to return to. Some carried trauma that their era had few words to describe. Yet the farewell mattered because it showed that the army would not remain a permanent ruling force. The United States had won with soldiers, but it would not be governed by soldiers. That distinction was not automatic. History offered many examples of victorious generals turning military fame into political domination. Washington's choices gave the American Revolution a different ending. He would now travel to Annapolis, where Congress was meeting. There he would do something that astonished observers across the Atlantic. He would give power back. On December 23, 1783, George Washington appeared before Congress in Annapolis, Maryland. He had been appointed Commander-in-Chief in 1775. He had led through Boston, New York, Trenton, Princeton, Brandywine, Valley Forge, Monmouth, the Long Watch over the Hudson, Yorktown, Newburgh, and the uncertain peace. Now he stood before the civilian authority that had commissioned him. He resigned. The act was simple in form and enormous in meaning. Washington handed back his commission and asked to retire to private life at Mount Vernon. This was not only personal modesty, it was political theater in the best sense. A public action meant to teach a republic how power should behave. The general who could have demanded more chose to become a citizen again. Monarchs, ministers, soldiers, and observers in Europe understood the significance. A victorious commander voluntarily surrendering power was rare enough to feel almost ancient. The comparison to Cincinnatus, the Roman who returned to his farm after serving the Republic, became part of Washington's image. But we should not mistake the moment for an ending without tension. The United States under the Articles of Confederation was weak. Congress had struggled to pay the army. The states often guarded their own interests. The country had enormous debts and uncertain authority. Washington's retirement did not mean the political system was secure. In fact, the weakness of the Confederation would help lead to the Constitutional Convention in 1787, and eventually to Washington's return as the first president. Still, the resignation at Annapolis gave the revolution its moral closing scene. The war had begun with resistance to power that Americans believed had become arbitrary. It ended with the most famous American soldier submitting himself to civilian rule. That mattered. Without it, victory might have looked like only a change of rulers. With it, the revolution could claim something more difficult. That power could be limited even by those who possessed it. The American Revolution ended with independence, but not with perfection. It created a republic where monarchy had once ruled. It gave the world a new example of colonial rebellion becoming sovereign government. It made George Washington an international figure. It made names like Lafayette, Greene, Morgan, Rochambeau, de Grasse, Franklin, Adams, Jay, Hamilton, and countless others part of a shared historical memory. It also left deep contradictions. The language of liberty existed beside slavery. Some northern states moved toward gradual abolition, but slavery remained entrenched in the South and protected by wealth, law, and violence. Thousands of enslaved people had sought freedom through the chaos of war, some with the British, some through other paths, and many remained in bondage after independence. Native nations faced a dangerous future. Many had fought to protect their homelands from American expansion. British defeat weakened one counterweight to settler pressure. The new United States would often treat Western land as the reward of independence, even when that land was already home to native peoples. Loyalists also paid a heavy price. Some remained and rebuilt lives under suspicion. Others fled to Canada, Britain, the Caribbean, or elsewhere, carrying their own memories of loss. Women had sustained households, farms, supply networks, boycotts, camps, and communities. But political rights remained sharply limited. The revolution changed political language faster than it changed social power. And yet, the revolution mattered because it opened arguments that could not easily be closed. Once a people declared that rights existed, that consent mattered, and that power could be challenged, those ideas did not stay politely within the boundaries set by 1783. Future generations would argue over them, expand them, betray them, and return to them. The war began at Lexington and Concord, with shots that no one could fully control. It passed through Boston, New York, Trenton, Saratoga, Valley Forge, Monmouth, the frontier, the South, the Atlantic, and Yorktown. It ended through patience, alliance, diplomacy, restraint, and a commander who surrendered power. America was not born complete. It was born contested. But by the end of 1783, it was born.